this sermon is Rethinking Life. So there's always a question, what does life look like? And you know that it looks different for different people. Sometimes the experience that people have is absolutely awful. And then other people, it's pretty good. It's not too bad. They have a good life. But I don't know if anybody's ever experienced this, only me, but even our best experiences, even the ones that are most perfect, are touched by this feeling of somehow it's just not enough. It's not quite perfect. Not quite all it could be. Something is missing, and it always seems to be just out of reach. Sadly, even the most perfect days and experiences are rare, so rare that if I pressed you on it, and I said, I need you to put together a list of all the perfect days you've had, you wouldn't be the whole day, it might be just part of a day. So, as an example, I'm going to give you a couple. I was taught boys at Boys Brigade and then Pioneer Boys and Team Kid, and every year I would make arrangements for all the boys who wanted to come and their fathers to come to a weekend camp out at Fundy Park. It would be the end of May, and we would sleep in tents, and it was always cold. Sometimes it snowed, and the next morning we'd wake up and have breakfast, and then we'd go for a hike. And this particular morning, like every other, we would have a backpack with some snacks in it, so we would have our snack on the way, and then dinner when we arrived, and then we would hike back. And so we stopped at this place, a creek, and there was butterflies. It was incredible. There was thousands of yellow butterflies everywhere. You could reach your hand up and pick butterflies out of the air. Wonderful. It was perfect. Magical, even. Well, there was another case where we were at Camp Wildwood as a family, Funny Park camping as a family, and we were heading out to Point Wolf, and there was always a sign that said deer crossing, but this particular day it was perfect because there was a deer standing at the deer crossing, and we came to a stop. The deer crossed the road at the deer crossing sign. How perfect is that, right? Well, another day, when we were camping that week, we were at the river down by the bridge, the covered bridge. And I had two of the children. The third was in the camper with my wife because she was a baby. And the two children were in the river. And we were just walking in the river. It was up to their knees, or up to my knees, and one of the kids, Amber, fell down. She slipped on the rocks and she fell in. And she started to cry, and then she realized that for some reason the river was perfect temperature. It was warm, and she started to laugh. And so the three of us spent the next 3/4 of an hour falling down on purpose. It was so much fun. And so if you add those two, you get an hour and a quarter. An hour and a quarter in 63 years of life. That's all the perfect days and all the perfect time I can come up with. And if you ask me, well, you could think harder than that, Peter. Surely there was more. And yes, but I would be hard-pressed to come up with 24 hours, added all together, of perfect events. I probably have to add some almost perfect events to make the 24 hours. So what's the proper definition of real human life? Well, real human life is only experienced by Adam and Eve in the time in the garden before the devil came and tempted them to sin. Since that time, there hasn't been any time where real human life has happened anywhere on earth. Well, there are some times where even though the world is broken by sin, and it's not perfect or anywhere near close to perfect, there's sometimes where there's something divine, almost divine happens. The apostles had spent 3 years with Jesus, and they had a bunch of divine experiences. What we would say perfect. I had one myself, a divine experience. I was at Hillsborough Church, and they were praying for the pastor's wife to be healed because she was going deaf. And all the pastors were around her, and they were praying. And then we prayed, and we backed up, and the speaker prayed. And when he prayed, she was healed, but my ears get all stuffed up inside on the other side of the eardrum. And so I couldn't hear properly, and in that instant, in that divine instant, I could hear again. Perfect. Well, the apostles had spent those 3 years with glimpses of the divine, and now it was coming to an end. And this was the Last Supper, because tomorrow he was going to be crucified, and it was going to be really sad. And we call it Good Friday because we know the end result. We know that it had to happen. But for them, it wouldn't have been anything good at all. And if you look at it, you can't help but think, well, Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew he would be beaten, and he knew he would be whipped, and he knew he would be crucified, and there would be the crown of thorns. And he knew that God would separate himself from him because he was taking on the sin of the world. He was going to suffer at a level of suffering unknown in the history of the world for sins he hadn't committed. And instead of requiring sympathy and compassion, he was giving it out freely. So let's look at this text. The first point is rain, rain, go away. Verse 1 says, do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Jesus was making sure that they understood that he and the Father were one. In verse 7 it says, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on you do know him and have seen him. And Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father. It is enough for us. Jesus said to him, have you been so long with me, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words which I say to you, I do not speak of my own initiative, but Father abiding in me does his works. Believe in me, and that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Otherwise believe because of the works themselves. He was saying that he was claiming that he and the Father were one. And he was saying these same kind of words. The Father does these things for you, the same kind of things that leaders throughout the Bible were saying. Back in Exodus, Moses was leading the people, and they were at the Red Sea, and the pressed hard against them was the army of Pharaoh. And Moses says in Exodus 14, verse 13, but Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians which you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Moses was saying the Lord will provide. This is what the Lord is going to do. These are the actions of the Lord. David said the same in Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 5, verse 23. They were going to fight the Philistines, and David inquired of the Lord and said, he said, you shall not go up directly up. Circle around behind them and come at them in front of the balsam trees. And it shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you will act promptly, for then the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. God was going to act for them. And David was saying, this is the Father, he's going to act for you. If you go back to the story of Noah and the ark, Noah in Genesis 6, in verse 19, and of every living thing, all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. And they shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, and the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing on the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. You see, as you start reading this, you say, oh no, how can I do this? How can I keep these? How can I collect up all these animals? But as you read this verse, it says, they will come to you. God is doing this. He's going to send the animals to Noah to put on the ark. Well, Jesus is explaining to them what history has shown of God's power is also his power. Jesus is and the Father are the same. So he's saying he made the rainbow after the flood as a sign. He piled the sea back on top of, in its place, back on top of the army of Pharaoh. It was his troops that were marching in the trees ahead of David's army. It was him in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now they would worship him in the same way they worshiped the Father. Number 2, that place of perfection. John 14, 2 and 3. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, just as I am, there you may be also. As I was saying, there's lots of, we think perfection is so little, so small, that almost perfect. Well, you know that a good percentage of everything we do is wasted. It's a fact of life in a broken world. When they pave a piece of road, you see it when they stop. There's a pile of pavement hardening into a lump on the side of the road. They brought too much. When you paint a room, there's always paint left in the bottom of the can. Or you didn't have enough and you have to go back and get another can, and then there's a lot left. In my driveway, in my property, there's a spot where the grass is growing, but 6 inches down is concrete. They poured the curbs and they filled up a big spot with the leftover concrete. When you do a hardwood floor, they tell you to buy 10% more because you're going to have waste. Well, Jesus didn't say there's lots of rooms and I'm preparing for you and I hope I make enough and I hope you don't have to sleep in the corridor because we didn't guess right. This was all planned perfectly, and every one of the rooms would fit the person it was planned for perfectly, and everyone would be happy. There wouldn't be this, we made all the rooms the same so that people wouldn't be jealous of you got a bigger room. I remember going to the Algonquin motel in St. Andrews, and there was a marriage conference, and a lot of people from Hillside Church went there. I think there was 26 couples, and we each had a room, and that was part of the cost of the conference. And you didn't pick your own room, you just got what came to you. and our friends that were with us said that their room was so small that if you walked in and you wanted to sit on the bed, you couldn't sit down because you couldn't turn around. You had to back out of the room and back in to sit on the bed. Of course, it was an exaggeration, but they were saying the room was small. Well, our room was huge. It was bigger than the width of this sanctuary. It was a big room. It was 2 rooms that they'd taken the center divider out and made it into 2 rooms. We invited everybody to our room, and 20 people in the room, and it didn't feel crowded. Well, Jesus didn't do things by halves. There was no one that was going to say, this isn't right for me. And the nice thing is that this is comforting. Jesus is comforting them. He knows that they're going to have more than their share of pain in the next few days. But he wants them to know that he's overcome the world. He's going to the Father, and where he is, he's going to get it ready for them. So when they come to him, it'll be perfect. It's one of those promises of the future home that's in Revelations about how perfect it is. And we're going to be with him in the home. And his Father is going to be our Father. And the place will be perfect. And there's never going to be this nagging feeling of, well, it was almost good, but I'm nitpicking about this and that. No. There's never going to be a feeling that you missed out. Well, number 3 is, Thomas asked the question that the rest are thinking. In verse 4 it says, and you know the way that where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. He says, you know the way I'm going. And you got to love Thomas because he's always the one that asks that question or says that thought that everyone else is thinking but is afraid to because they don't want to seem stupid. And Jesus says, you know the way I'm going. And they didn't. And Thomas asked that question. Jesus was going the right way. That's what was happening. He was going the right way. Everything in the world goes the wrong way. There's something called the second law of thermodynamics. And what the second law of thermodynamics is that everything is losing energy. The sun is burning out. Eventually, everything will be minus 400 Celsius, absolute zero. There won't be one drop of energy in the entire universe. Well, Jesus is going in the other direction. The world is winding down. He's going the other direction, away from eternal death of everything, to life that will never end. He was saying that they knew this, and there's a hope built into every human that some people call a God-sized hole in their heart. Everyone knows that there's something that's out there that you can almost reach, but it's not, you can't. And he's saying that no matter what, he's going to arrange for us to be with him. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I've got this. You can trust me. And you need to follow me. And if you do, in due time, you will be with me in glory. And you can't do it your own way. There's no way you can fix it yourself. It'll just go badly. He says, I am the way. And if you choose any other ways, it's going to end for you badly. Well, how does this apply to us in 2021? Well, Jesus is preparing us for heaven. You've heard that expression. He's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good. Well, that's a lie. I'm borrowing this from Tim Keller. He used this teaching on something unrelated, but he used this, and he said that people who are heavenly minded are the most earthly good of anyone. And he told of this time in the early church in the Roman Empire. They had 2 plagues, and these plagues moved around and they lasted 15 years each. And what would happen is, if this plague came to your city, you would flee. And if somebody in your family happened to be sick, you left them. And the doctors never looked after anyone because it wasn't safe. And we don't know what the plagues were. They could have been measles or chicken pox or mumps or something else. But what would happen is when they left the people, they just died. And the truth was that only 30% would die. If the rest would recover if they had proper care, just basic care. Somebody to bring them water, somebody to wash their face when they had a fever, someone to look after them a little bit. Well, the earthly minded people all left, but the heavenly minded people, the Christians, stayed, and they looked after the people in their family, and yes, 30% of them did die, but 70% lived as compared to the rest of the population. But they did something else too. They went into these houses where people were dying, and they brought them out and they looked after them. And so when in that city the plague had run its course and everybody came back, they discovered that their family members, who they assumed were dead, weren't. They had lived because the Christians had looked after them. And not only were they alive, but they were now Christians. Because, you see, they understood that these Christians had an eternal home, an eternal promise with Jesus. And they understood to live as Christ, to die as gain. That passage in Philippians 1:21 says, Paul is saying, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed for both directions, having the desire to depart and to be with Christ, for that is much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake." These people who were heavenly minded knew that if they died, it was only better. I've been reading this book, I finished it, called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And the story is how hard their life was, how scary their life was in the years before Christ, and then up until the 5th century, where God decided to do something about it. A young boy, 15, was captured in England and sold as a slave to Ireland. And he spent the next 6 years looking after sheep all by himself. And he didn't have proper clothes, he was never warm enough, and he never had enough food to eat. And even when somebody came, it was worse than being alone, because he couldn't speak the language properly, and he knew there was a better than even chance of him getting a beating because they couldn't make him understand them. And so the only person he had to talk to was Jesus. And for 6 years he did this, and then Jesus said to him, "You're to go to the coast." And he got up and left. And if he had been caught, he would have been killed or worse. And he got to the coast, and through a miracle, God put him on a ship, and through more miracles, he ended up getting him back to England and his family. But those 7 years, he had lost the chance of being educated. And now he was in England, and God came to him and said, "You're to go to Ireland with the gospel." And so in spite of the fact that he'd missed those years of education and now he had to start again and it was much harder, he became a bishop and he went to Ireland. And he came there, and to give you an idea just how scary life was in Ireland for these people, there's a story of their last great war, and the two sides are separated by a field, and in the dark, their gods are screaming about the horrors that will happen in the battle the next day. And 100 men, hardened soldiers, die of fright. And the rest, it goes on to say that the only reason they could sleep that night is they drank themselves into a place where it was the only possible thing was that they would pass out. Well, he came there, and he had no weapon, and he refused to be, he was not going to be intimidated by them. And they appreciated this bravery of here was this man who had no weapon. And you see, there was something else they discovered, is that he wasn't afraid of the afterlife. He wasn't afraid at all. He didn't live with fear. And they couldn't figure this out because as they spent time with him, they realized that he would, the end of the day would come and he would lay down and he would go to sleep like a baby. And they couldn't figure this out. All the rest of them had to have a lot of alcohol to get them to sleep. Well, these fierce people came to admire him for this. And they said in the book that the gods of the Irish were horrible. They would give children nightmare and adults the willies. And they called for human sacrifices. And now, St. Patrick was telling them about a God who sacrificed himself for them. And what's more, when all the trials on earth were over, you would be with the one who loved you enough to sacrifice his life for you. And this fear wouldn't even be a memory there. And for people who lived with crippling fear day and night, this was too good of news to ignore. And it's the only country that converted without bloodshed, without people being martyred. And they chose to follow his God. See, we live in a culture where the fear of life and death is not something you get up in the morning with and it requires alcohol to get to sleep from. It's mostly good for us. And we read in this chapter where it says, I go to prepare a place for you. That's wonderful news. It is nice. It's good. But for people whose life is a terror, it's more than just good news. It's beyond hope, beyond good fortune, that it could happen to anyone. And it should be that way with us. We should say, this is amazing, this is great. And we carry with us this message of hope and a future. And the problem is, if we just carry it and we don't share it, then what about our neighbors? We're shortchanging the people around us. The Irish saved the civilization because what had happened is that Rome had fallen, and all these libraries with commentaries and the books of the Bible were all burnt. Except that the Irish saved all of that. And it was so that they didn't just stay where they were. They went to Scotland and England, and they evangelized, and then they went to Europe. It was said 150 or 200 years later that of the 315 commentaries, 285 of them were Irish. They saved the world. They replanted the fields that were been stripped bare by violence. And it's our jobs to replant the fields of Albert County that have been stripped by people, the media, and the world saying you don't need a God. It's not true. Everyone has a God-shaped hole in their heart that only God can fill. And it's our job to bring that story of salvation and say to them that we're so heavenly minded that we are earthly good. We have the story of salvation, and we need to bring it to the people who need it. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the message of an eternal home we will spend with you. In Jesus' name.